thing to keep in mind about working with mobile devices is the devices are meant to be used in a connected environment. Also, most mobile devices have slightly limited internal storage. Oftentimes, people store their data off the device on some type of server, and then they access that data through the server as a web service. Also, data that changes constantly can be used through a web service as well. For example, weather data or stock quotes. All are the type of thing you might want to access through a web service. So what you're looking at is a quick PHP web service I've created that creates lottery numbers and puts them up on the web. It also actually displays them. So here essentially all I'm doing is creating random numbers between 1 and 42 and then outputting them as numbers. So here's what it looks like if we access it through the web. And of course, each time I access it, we get a separate set of numbers. So this is our external web service that we're going to get data from. So in order to do that on the device, we're going to have to use a technique known as AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It's been a common technique on the web for years, and now we're going to apply that to the mobile environment in order to receive data. Now, I should mention this is the simplest possible query, because all we have to do is go to this particular URL, and we'll get the data. So let's go ahead and create our application. We can go ahead and create an application this time for, let's create an Android app. And I'll go ahead and I'm going to drag the binaries folder onto my terminal. And terminal window loads. And it looks like we loaded 2 terminal windows. Let's see which one we want to be in here. I think it's this one. Yep. So there we're in the bin. So now we'll use our create statement. So create, and then where we're putting it. So in my computer, it's users, my name, and desktop, and then the folder name. And we'll call this example lottery, because those are lottery numbers. Then comes our tv.learn-to-program.demos.lottery. So there's our package. And then finally our name for the program, which shouldn't have any spaces. I'll also call that lottery. All right, so it's building our Android app here. And there's our lottery folder. Move that into view. We no longer need our command line. We no longer need our PhoneGap folder. But I will get Eclipse going, and I'll get an emulator going as well. This way, when I need it, it will be running. We'll use our optimized Intel virtual device here. We'll start that up. Always recommend you get your devices started, because otherwise it could take you an awfully long time to wait to test, especially if you're on a slower machine. I'm actually on a fairly fast machine, so I have the luxury of loading it up as we go. Okay, so here's our application. And let's go ahead and we'll get our assets, www, and then inside of that is our index.html, and that's where we're going to get started. So I'm going to open that in my favorite text editor. Let's see, there it is. And then we'll be able to work with the content. The other thing I like to do is, of course, I can clean this up a little bit. We can get rid of some of these things that we don't need inside of assets, or things that I'm not going to use right now. So, for example, I'm going to get rid of this index CSS. Throw that in the trash. Let's bring it back. There we go. These images I'm not going to use. This index JavaScript I'm not going to use. Get rid of that. And looks like we're ready to go. All right, so let's clean up our template that's provided by PhoneGap. So let's see here. We don't need any of this except for the script link to Cordova. And again, I like to put that in the head of the document. Right there will work. And I don't use the style sheet. Matter of fact, I erased that style sheet, so it's a good idea to get rid of that as well. Perfect. Okay, so now we're ready to start coding. So remember, the object here is to get from the URL we looked at before that content. And of course, that content updates itself each time we access it. So we'll start with our initialization function. And of course, we use the anonymous function style for that. And in here, we're going to set up our device ready function. So we're going to use document, add event listener. And the event we're listening for is device ready. We're going to go ahead and call a function called init this time, and I'm going to set the last argument to false. All right, so when we load, we're going to go ahead and get the device ready event ready, and then we're going to have our init function here, which will be called when the device is ready. Now, first thing we need to do in order to get the data from the server is create an XML HTTP request object. That's a part of JavaScript, and it's available in all of the major browser platforms for mobile. So we'll go ahead and use var to declare it. XML HTTP will be our local name. And then once the device is ready, we're going to instantiate it. So XML HTTP equals new XML HTTP request, just like that. Okay, so now we've got our object declared. So the next thing we need to do is configure our object. We're actually going to configure a couple of things. First, we're going to configure the callback function that's going to react when the data comes back from the server. The reason we need to use a callback function is that it takes a bit of time for your request to go out, regardless of what type of data network it's going out on, and the server to formulate and send the response. So it's happening in an asynchronous manner. So we've got to basically wait for the response. So we'll set that up with XML HTTP on ready state change. And you'll see how that deals with the response here in a few minutes. So let's go ahead and call this response. Or actually, let's call this process response. So what's going to happen is when the ready state property of the XML HTTP object changes, it's going to call process response. So now we also have to set up our connection itself, and we do that with open. Now, open has 3 arguments. The first argument is the protocol, which can be get or post. In this case, it doesn't really matter. I use get. The second is the URL. Let's go ahead and set that up actually as a variable up here, just make things a little bit neater. Paste that right there. So the second argument is the URL. The third argument is whether or not we want this to happen asynchronously, which means we want the connection to occur while the user is still allowed to do other things. So finally, we can send and get our response from the server. So it's an asynchronous process. So the next thing we're going to need to do is process the response. So what happens is that there is a ready state property. That ready state property starts at 0, meaning there's no connection, till 4, meaning the server has responded. Once we get that response, we can process it. We can only process it when that ready state value is at 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to test XML HTTP.readyState, and we're going to make sure that value is 4. It's also a good practice to make sure the status that you got was 200. That's the HTTP status for OK, just like 404 means file not found. So if both those things are true, we've got a response from the server. Now, if those two things aren't true and our code is correct, then in our else statement, we can go ahead and indicate a waiting condition to the user. So this is the time for some type of indication to the user that we're waiting on a response. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's change this title. It's not Hello World. This is Lottery Numbers. Now down here in the body, let's go ahead and put a div where we can get a result from the server. So this is where our result will go. And we'll get that result here if the ready state is 4 and the status is 200. So let's go ahead and use document, get element by ID, result, and we're going to set its inner HTML to XML HTTP dot response text. Okay, so now let's go ahead and set some other message for the user while we're waiting. So I'm going to grab the same div, and we're going to set its inner HTML to, this time let's just do strong waiting. So this way, if it takes a while to get that connection, which it might on an actual device, the user will have some indication that it's not broken. We're waiting for some kind of response. Obviously, there are more creative ways of doing this as well. All right, so we're initializing here when the device is ready. We're setting the URL. We're making the request object. We're setting the response when the ready state changes. We are opening our connection, and we're sending it, and then we're dealing with the response down here. All right, so this is everything we need to get the simple response from the server. So let's go ahead and bring up Eclipse and test. So here in Eclipse, I haven't actually brought this into Eclipse yet, so we're going to use File, New, and again, Project, Android project from existing code. I conveniently have this right on my desktop called Lottery. And in just a moment, that'll be loaded into memory. We get that initial error. So I'm going to go ahead and select the project, click, choose Properties, and we'll use 4.1.2, and click OK. We're not using the Google APIs, so we don't need to load those. Just increases your loading time. And then we're going to do Project and Clean to rebuild the project, and our errors should disappear. You still have this one warning. Don't worry about it. It's something outside of your control, something in the internals that you're not necessarily concerned with at this point. Okay, so we've got all this, and now it's time to test. So let's go ahead and create a debug configuration, Android application. Our project here is, that's the only one open, Lottery. We'll target the Intel 2, and we'll go ahead and click debug. Okay, so there's our device, and oops, looks like we've got an error here on line 37. If you're testing on the device, you can go into the Logcat application in the Eclipse environment, and you can go ahead and make or you can see any errors that occur. They'll be in red, and it looks like I just have one too many T's in there. So all we got to do, let's go back to our text editor. Oh, and it actually looks like I made 2 errors here. Right up there on line 37. It's nice when it tells you where it is. It's not always correct. And there we go. It wants the capital XML HTTP request. Oop, and before we run, I see one more typo right there. Ready state has to have a capital S. All right, so we're going to go ahead and give this a shot. Go ahead and pull it up Eclipse here. And let's go ahead and click the bug. Oops, saw a lot of red there. Never a good sign. Hey, look, there's our lottery numbers. Now, if we go ahead and run this again, let's click Lottery. We should get, we getting the same ones or another set here? Let's see. 30, yep, we're getting different lottery numbers each time. 32, 40, 16. Let's go ahead and go back. 7, 38, 15. So we've been able to get data from the web service